get started, just because I want to make sure we get through all three Taboo Talk reports before we're done. So good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for really what is a time of adult education, but really a time of updating on behalf of all of us who went through the Zeidler Center process. We received a grant about a year ago to engage the congregation in discussing faith and politics and the intersection thereof. And the grant allowed us to, with significant savings, bring in the Zeidler Center for Public Discussion for 3 two-hour sessions, essentially, the topics of which were up to us. And they do this with 5 ELCA churches every year, because Zeidler Center is separate from, but still connected to Redeemer Lutheran on Wisconsin Avenue, where Frank Zeidler, one of the socialist mayors of Milwaukee, was both a member and has a lasting legacy there as well. And so, the Zeidler Center was here with us back in kind of late November, early December to talk a little bit about our first Taboo Talk, what we learned a little bit from that, and also to kind of share about their method and their programs. Today we're really going to walk through kind of what we learned as a congregation from each session. They put together about a 30-page executive report for us from each session. And so I did my best to condense that into some themes and variations, some of which the Zeidler Center did for us, and others that I've done. So some of this is through their lens. Most of it is actually. So I'll just I'll open my backpack. Some of this is filtered through my editorial lens as well. Darla from the social ministry group, who's right there, hi Darla, and Pastor Chris and I met with the Zeidler facilitators each time after the process. So we've gone through this a little bit more in depth. And these reports have been shared in full with the council members as well. We've had some discussion about that as well, and we'll talk a little bit about next steps toward the end today. Are there questions that people want to make sure we talk about, or that you're really wanting to make sure we at least respond to, if not answer, before we get started? I'd like to just have a sense of that. Yeah, Vic?
I just have a quick one. Like, about how many people participated in each of the 3?
Yeah, we had, altogether, over the 3 sessions, we had about 130 participants. Our first one was the most successful, in part because it was the broadest, and it was, we considered the least busy time of year. We kind of tried to do it before Christmas Advent stuff started. So we had close to 60 at the first discussion, and then about 25 to 30 at the subsequent 2. And there were new people at every discussion, which was, I think, good. That it wasn't, we had a lot of repeaters, which is part of the goal, but there were new people who tried it at each iteration that we did. We tried both Sunday nights and Wednesday nights. So Wednesday night did not prove fruitful. It was also in the middle of January, where it snowed the day before and day of. So, it's just... and I would say most people who shared feedback with us outside of the Zeidler report said that they wished there was more ideological diversity in all 3. But that's really hard because it's all self-selected and all kind of reported. And so I think part of that is probably both a reporting, not problem, issue, in that I think people who feel they're in the minority are less likely to be fully open in a self-reporting scale of where they might be out of fear and all these other pieces. And I think that applies to both sides. And then also, we did our best to try to have RSVPs so that the groups could be diverse, but sometimes that was harder to achieve because people might have had diverse political perspectives, but when it came to the issues we were talking about, everyone was kind of in the same boat. So I think some people left saying, I thought we were going to argue more, which is not the point of these conversations, but I think that was one of the takeaways that we heard from participants, was that they were hoping that there would be more ability to have inter-perspective dialogue. Although, I'll speak from my own example, I thought in terms of the last one on immigration, we had a really diverse group of our 4, and not in opposition to one another, but just really different angles in which we talked about our experiences. And so part of the questions that the Zeidler Center wrote with us were guided so that it wouldn't feel as confrontational. So some of that is people might not have reported accurately. Some of that is we just didn't have a wide diversity. And the third part is, that wasn't our goal. Let's make sure the people who think one way are totally in a different room than the people that aren't. That we wanted people to feel safe and comfortable. And so methodologically, we learned that we would love to have more diverse participation, but it's hard to do that with people's schedules and otherwise. And I think that, I'll just stop for that, but that's a little bit. So we had close to 130 people all together, which we thought was really excellent. And to have 6, we ran out of food at the first one, so we said, well, we'll just quit feeding people. But it seemed to be a good process. Other questions we want to make sure before I head into data. My little statistical analysis brain really likes this. There's some graphs and scatter plots. If you have questions on the way, feel free to interrupt too as we talk about this as well. So what did we seek to do in this process? I went back this week and found the email I sent to the Zeidler Center about a year ago saying, here's what our goals were in applying for this. And so we had 6 goals that are on the slides here. One is to deepen the experience that social ministry leaders and the council had. We participated in a synod-sponsored listening activity about political values a year ago in January. It was one of the things that Bishop Erickson kind of found 5 areas for congregations to talk about hard issues, and they set forth an agenda. Here's what you want to talk about. And so we did that both as a council and as a social ministry team, and found that to be fruitful. And so part of why this seemed like a good option was to follow up on that and to go deeper. Also, we hope to help people gain a deeper understanding about how their own political perspectives connect or don't connect with their values, faith, and theological beliefs. One of the things that I've encountered a lot of articles recently, and we'll share one at the end with you, but that suggests that one's political identity in America right now, and really over the past 10 years, has really trumped one's religious identity on a spectrum across the country. So that you're more likely to be able to say, or if you run up to a stranger, you're more likely to say your political perspective than you are, well, I'm a Lutheran. Which, in my personal experience, actually makes sense a little bit. But that, so one of the goals we had is, how can we help people at St. Matthew's feel like they have opportunity to connect what they believe politically with their faith, or what they don't, and that works both ways. I'll use my own self for an example. So my perspectives on, what's the word? I can't think of it. Usury, high interest loans, are informed more by my economic perspective than by my faith perspective. Because I was an economics student, so my perspectives are more shaped by that part of me than they are by my faith part. Now, is that saying they're totally opposite? No. But that, how do we help people wrestle with that at a deeper level? The third thing we wanted to do was to develop tools and skills to help us listen. And that's us in the royal we, but also us as pastors and staff. How do we listen if someone has a different opinion on something or has some feedback, and not just political feedback, but any feedback? How do we listen well? Not lose our cool or not automatically put our defenses up. Because I think that's human nature, and especially when there's critique involved. So how do we listen to anyone who has a differing opinion on something that stokes passionate response? And so those are kind of the first 3 goals. The second 3 were to educate the congregational leaders and the pastors about what does the congregation really want? That it's really easy sometimes as pastors and as staff to live in a bubble that, well, we know St. Matthew's, and especially with the staff of our longevity, where Pastor Ann and I are the only staff members in the program staff area who haven't been here at least 10 years. And even Al Venleth, our new finance person, has been a member for longer than that. And so I think it becomes easy for us sometimes to say, well, we know the church. And so part of the goal in having these conversations was, well, let's see where we're at. Because I think that was important. Because it helps us figure out how do we best respond. Is our response doing something that the people want us to do? Or are we doing something they don't? How do we respond to that? Another goal was to offer space to those who identified as outside of what they perceive to be the majority opinion, and to offer people brave space and safe space to share their beliefs and values. So safe space is one piece. That is space that is as low judgment. There's no judgment-free zones, even when we say it. So as low judgment as possible, but also brave space, where people feel encouraged to maybe share parts of their story, beliefs, values that they might not feel comfortable all the time. So safe space is one thing, it's about one's personal self. Brave is about the community. And then the last piece was, how do we help learn better communication skills to respond to current events? And how do we engage the faith community more effectively? We've had many conversations. An example of this with a contentious topic politically is, how do we respond after school shootings? How do we respond effectively? Is there an expectation we respond after each? Where does that response happen? Through what channels and discussion? There's no right answer to that. But the way that happens can relate to a variety of different emotions and other pieces. And where that happens, we'll talk about the kind of channels for that as well as we go. But that's one example that comes up again with the Santa Fe shooting on Friday. How do we communicate that as pastors, as a church, as community? Do we communicate? Those sort of questions. We knew the Zeidler process wasn't going to answer all of those for us, but these were good goals. Does that make sense? Questions? So we set up a time and a schedule and a date and work with the Zeidler Center to put together what we came to call Taboo Talks. And our first Taboo Talk was about politics in the church. And I found the subtitle, Where Do We Start? And then Where Do We Go? And so this was our largest conversation. I thought it was one of the most helpful. And it was the place where we saw the most diversity of opinion. But we saw a lot of clusters of opinion around the same kind of focal points. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The Zeidler Center likes this, the process of word clouds. Who here wasn't a part of one of the conversations?
Wasn't?
Was not. Yeah. So the way it worked is that each session had 3 questions. And each participant went around in a group of 6 to 8 and had 2 to 3 minutes, depending on how many people were in the group, to respond for themselves and not to another person. And so then you would breathe. And in the meantime, the facilitators from the Zeidler Center were the facilitators who said, actually, no, you're responding to the person before you. They were there to redirect as necessary, but also they were there to take copious notes that were then transcribed. And so we have, as part of the report, highlights of what everyone shared anonymously. So I can go through and say, oh, that's what I said. And I'll do that in a couple of places today, because I know what I said and I feel comfortable sharing what I said. But what they did is they took all of those transcripts and put them into the algorithm that creates a word cloud. And so this is the first word cloud. And you can see here the words that came out most were people, politics, others, like, don't, maybe those went together, feel, different, any words stick out there? I know it's not as big as it is in my little screen. Want.
Can. Social.
Social, that's one we'll talk about. Trigger was part of the question, one of the questions, so we'll get to that in a second. So that was there because we asked people what triggers you. And so they said, well, what triggers me is, and so I'm guessing that's part of the reason that's there. So these are interesting. We have one of those features. Yeah, Myron.
Why is it, I don't understand the cloud versus the cross.
The cloud is just in the shape of a cross. So
But why the shape of the cross?
That's what the Zeidler Center people picked.
You don't know why?
I don't know why.
Oh, okay.
Nope. They figured we were church. Let's see, what is a symbol of Christianity? I don't know. The Holy Spirit dove. So they have different ones in each one, but this is the one that they gave us. The algorithm, you kind of tell it what shape you want, and then it does the words corresponding in size to frequency.
Not one of the biggest words, but it's interesting toward the bottom that the word white is there.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit too. Yeah, that's a good pickup. Other words stick out?
Believe.
Believe, yeah. I like positive at the very bottom in the light blue. It's really hard to squint and see. So the first question of the first session was to describe a personal experience when you noticed politics in church. And this was any church. So it's important to note when we look at the data here that this is not just a St. Matthew's reflected response. And I would say, my guess is, Darla, you were part of the hearing too, that I would say about half of the people shared St. Matthew's experiences and half shared other church experiences. It felt about half and half. So I think it does give us a good representative kind of sample. And then they asked to share feelings. And so the themes that emerged from this were that 20 respondents showed that their experience of politics in church was related to the presidential election, and not just 2016, but other presidential elections also, toward elected officials and American politics in general. That's not surprising to me, and that was definitely the most response. The next cluster of people all shared that their experience was connected to LGBTQ acceptance and or rejection in sermons. So that was a big takeaway that connected to that issue, but also to that medium. And we'll talk a little bit more about the medium as we go. 7 people thought their experiences were most connected to discussions of racism and or white privilege. And again, these are both positive and negative. It doesn't have to be a bad experience. So it might be, I'm glad we've been talking about this, or it may be uncomfortable when we talked about this. I think there were both of those in that category. 6 people shared how their stories of experience meant they felt included or excluded because of the church's political stance or position on certain political issues. So that the church thinks this, I feel excluded. The church doesn't think this, I feel included, or whatnot. And then 3 people shared that their experience was feeling a lack of tolerance for an opinion that wasn't of a majority perspective. So feeling like they weren't tolerated because they didn't go with the pack. And I think the most interesting is the feeling words that were part of the first one. Feeling words about these experiences of politics in church were more negative than positive. It included fear over dissension, discomfort, anxiety, anger, challenge, frustration, surprise. It was positive surprise in that one. I remember that when I was putting this together. I was surprised we talked about this. But there were also shock in a negative way, being turned off, feeling respected, feeling hurt, feeling overall respectfulness as opposed to just personal respect, struggle, heartbreak, guilt, appreciation, judgment, and exclusion. If nothing else, this is a good reason to have these conversations, to at least have it be heard and shared. Here's what people's experiences, not just at St. Matthew's, but in church in general, were around political issues. Thoughts there? Yeah, look.
Maybe this was made manifest when we were in the talks, but do these relate to the experiences of people with clergy of the church, or do they relate to experiences with their peers in the congregation?
I would say yes to both. Some people's responses were very pastor or leadership centric. Some people's responses were parking lot centric. Like, I heard this in the parking lot after I left. Some people's responses were more, I would say more isolated. One of the ones I remember was that I don't feel like I'm connected to the political perspectives of the ELCA. I don't know if there's a place for me. Was one of the, again, anonymous pieces that came through. So kind of feeling isolated, but not directly toward any one person or group of people, but just wrestling with those wider pieces. Yeah, but those feeling words, I remember when I first read this, I'm like, whew, this is both heavy, but also it was in some ways freeing, at least for me, to see these words, and I'm sure Pastor Chris and Carla can share too, but just to offer people space to let that out. Because it's clear that sometimes it doesn't feel like it's safe space. And one-on-one might not feel safe space. And this conversation, the pastors were separate. We were in our own group so that we wouldn't be like, I'm going to take notes on what you're saying. You know, not that we were going to do that anyway, but it was a sense of how do we help protect people's sense of safety. The second question, so the goal of these three questions was always to start with a personal experience and then move to a value question. So what is your value? And then how are you going to respond? So that's kind of the secret to the Zeidler process that you can figure out if you go to a couple of these, that personal experience, value, now what? And so the second question was, what was a word or phrase or connotation you hear at St. Matthew's, so this is church specific, that tends to trigger you, and trigger, we determine, could be positive or negative. So what's a phrase that you hear that gets you like, yeah, I'm glad I'm here? Or what's a word that you hear that goes, oh. And then, what values underlie that response? It was hard for people to get to the values. It was easy to say what the triggers were, but harder to say the values. But what was awesome, I think, and fascinating, I did not expect this, was that we had more positive triggers than negative among those people who shared. So 12 people said their positive triggers were words connected to outreach. God's work, our hands, showed up a lot. Words that remind us that we're service-oriented in our mission. And then 2 groups of 8 each, positive triggers with love, grace, peace, and forgiveness. So those would be theological values that I think fits the sort of preaching and teaching and messages that we try to share here on a regular basis. So good job, those 8 people, extra points, whoever you were. And then 8 people shared positive triggers with words that were related to acceptance or welcoming, or with denunciation of racism or other isms. So that could be either welcome and affirming towards LGBTQ people was positive, or we're talking about racism, and that I'm glad to hear that. Other people said that on the opposite coin, you know. And so what we determined was there's no one universal response, right? 6 people shared a negative trigger related to exclusion and or prejudice, and so that would be like the phrase "those people." So when you hear "those people" at church, that was a negative trigger. And that one came up multiple times among those 6. 3 reflected negative triggers, so the same way to usages of white privilege and or racism. Other respondents said the word political and references to being divided were triggers, which I think makes sense given the fact that that's pretty much the news, regardless of your news outlets. The word on the street is, we're more divided than ever. I don't know how true that is, and we can talk about that another time, but I think that that's a little bit of the challenge. And then 2 respondents said they could not think of a time when they felt triggered by any word or phrase. Yeah.
Pastor Matt, when people were going through these and you would see like a cluster of this or a cluster of that, like the "those people," language, did it seem like most of us came out of like a single group where kind of people followed a theme, or were they really kind of coming from everywhere?
We don't know for sure, because the way those other folks disseminated the information back to us wasn't group 1, group 2.
Yeah.
But my sense is we had 6 groups, so my guess is that came from multiple places. And I think, I'll just speak to the group I was in, I remember that was one of the phrases that was used. And it wasn't referred to necessarily church leaders, but just hearing people at church use the phrase, those people.
Yeah.
And so, it happened to me at the chiropractor the other day. It was really awkward. And so, I don't know what to do or say here. Help! I'm prone down. I'm getting adjusted. I don't know how. I won't go back now. But that sort of phrasing, and it might have been that somewhere that happened at church.
Yeah, and I'm not just those people, but I'm just kind of wondering when the clusters come up. I was like, oh, did one person in a group say something and other people kind of chimed in, or was it kind of coming from all over?
My sense is it probably came from all over, also because of the facilitators trying to keep people on their own track.
Yeah.
But the fact that there were so many clusters like this was surprising to me, and we were able to see in the full reports the clusters of the actual responses, so that there was a little bit more context to that. But I don't want to bore you all by reading through all of those responses. The third question at the first session was, where should the boundaries be? And this was the most practical piece. I think this is the place that was, at least for me as a pastor, most helpful. It's the answers I was hoping to get when we started this process. And what was clear here that there was a number of kind of, I don't want to use the word camps, but there were, because that feels like up against people, but there were a number of kind of clusters of opinions that were very clear and very differentiated from one another. So 11 people said politics should not be part of church life, bar none. The question, where should the boundaries be? So, of the 60 or so people there, a sixth of them essentially said, not at all. About another sixth said, we should be informed by politics, but maintain open dialogue when we talk about it. So to give space for something like this. Another sixth said, what is the law? No endorsements, no political signs. That's essentially the 501c3 rules would be that. So about a sixth people said, not at all. Another six said, something open where there's dialogue. Another six said, follow the law. Another sixth, it's fascinating, this is almost equal across the way, said Jesus should be the marker of the boundary. Be as this is a quote from someone's response, be as political as Jesus Christ would be, follow the Bible. 8 other respondents said that the discussions of anything political needed to fit under social issues or else not be discussed. So that if it's a social political issue, and again, what does that mean? Yeah. But if it's not a social issue, off the table. And then another, essentially the last sixth and the others, or what they call on election day, the scattering, is that whatever it was, balance was necessary to keep from alienating people. So what we saw was, we have about 6 primary opinions, none of which has really a majority over the other. And so when we think about politics in church, there's no choir to which we're preaching, quite literally, which was interesting feedback. And I remember sitting there at Darla when we first went through, these numbers are all so close, how did this happen? There wasn't, and I think that's actually helpful for us to share and name. Not because it doesn't make necessarily things easier, but it helps people break down the notion in their head that St. Matthew's all thinks the same way, and I don't. Well, actually, no. This is a community that, about politics and church, is fairly divided across 6 different perspectives. And I think that can be helpful for us to share because it breaks down some of those preconceived resentments or expectations that make it harder to feel like there's community or fit. Yeah, Pastor Ed.
I've long been concerned about the whole issue of politics in the church, or perceived discussions of politics, and it seems to me there might be some positive movement if we could talk about policies rather than politics. Now, people will still hear politics probably, but it's the policies that seem to me to be related to biblical themes, you know, what's fair, what's just, who's being left behind, who's being discriminated against. Those are policy issues. And if we could talk about it that way, maybe it would get us away from the issues of which party are you talking about?
Yeah, that's a helpful phrase. I think, I'll move to the next slide here a little bit, that I think our definitions are not the same on lots of things. You know, and so whether it's the word politics or social or justice, boy, you know, I'm guessing for every 6 people you ask, there might be 6 different definitions there too. And so one of the takeaways that I think policy can be a helpful way to think about it. I think one of the challenges, and this is just my own takeaway, personally, this isn't Zeidler stuff, putting on my Matt hat. I happened to be at a conference call from the ELCA Advocacy Office this week about the Farm Bill, which was up for vote on Thursday in the House. It'll be up in the vote. It has to be approved by September, I think, for the next 5 years. And they talked about Farm Bill as it relates to hunger and other things. And at the end of the webinar, I sent in a question. I said, is there any guidance as to which way our, Wisconsin has, 8 House members in Congress? The 8 representatives, so Sensenbrenner or Ryan or Grothman or along the way. Is there any inkling as to how this will play out on this policy? House Resolution 2, the Farm Bill. And the advocacy person from Feeding America said, well, the Republicans have written this, and they're going to all vote for it, and the Democrats aren't. And so really there's nothing we can do policy-wise to convince them otherwise.
That's not the way it worked out.
It's not the way it worked out, but that was the takeaway of this message, was the policy needed change, but that the policymakers, or it became partisan in this weird way that I wasn't expecting. I just want to know, who's on the fence, who's going to be open to hearing what we hear. And so my concern is that both on a national level and a state level, that policy is becoming more and more partisan. I don't know if that's true or not. So that's for me a back and forth. But what's clear is we need some words to talk about this, right?
Do you think it seems that it's becoming more partisan because people are not able to separate policy from party politics?
That seems a fair take to me. I think a lot of it has to do with identity also, and I want to make sure we get there at the end. There's a really interesting stuff out there now about how one's political identity almost, again, as I said at the beginning, is almost more important than lots of other identities. And so that's not true for everyone. I don't know if it's true for me personally, but that sort of, it feels like there's a lot more side taking early on, and a lot less ability to work together on that national level. Now, as a church, I think there's good space for us to be able to work together and figure out things that way. So what did we learn from session 1? No one's of the same mind, but we are clustered, and we're clustered equally, which again I think is really important. People were very different in their expectations of church and politics based on how they define each term. So a lot of responses we said, I felt uncomfortable because I come to church not to be challenged. Or I'm glad that we're doing this because I come to church to feel challenged. So more than one's political affiliation, how you view what you come to church for, super important. That was good learning for us as a congregation. And I think that's also helpful because it helps us from keeping people in boxes, so on and so forth. It was very clear that the pulpit and the liturgy, especially the prayers, were places where people's political radar got pinged, and reactions were heightened. And the reason for that mostly was that because those places don't offer space for conversation in community and reflection. If I'm preaching, you don't say, but Pastor Matt, it's not a lecture, people seem much more open to something like an adult ed forum or a Zeidler conversation, that those, more than enough people said that was okay, but that it, and not to say that it doesn't mean we're going to not preach or have prayers that are involved things that might feel political to people, but that if that's the primary place that it's happening, then it's a place of concern. And I think that was really helpful feedback to receive. And among the issues that came up, especially in this first session, which we saw a little bit in the word cloud, people said they wanted to talk more or felt division around race, class dynamics at St. Matthew's, welcoming and diversity, comfort, again, comfort, discomfort, why are people in church, and tension, which is the opposite side of that. So it seemed like those were things people felt eager or willing to talk some more about. Which led us to the second side. Oh, sorry, this is the last piece. They gave us a bunch of feedback like this as well. So before and after the first session, look how 17% felt their voice was heard and matters very little. At the end, no one said it mattered very little. So that something about going through the process of the listening circles moved those people who felt their voice had been heard very little, moved somewhere to the right. Which is actually really good statistical results as to, this is, the process of being able to be heard makes a difference. Does that make sense? I tried to interpret that really.
Well, why wouldn't it go up after a session?
Right, it should.
Right?
Yeah, and the Zeidler folks are always just looking for confirmation of that, for their own, this is, I think, more for their own piece than for, but it does help us say, we met the goal, people were able to feel heard. But I was surprised it just went from 17% said very little, and then they moved somewhere else. So to me, that was a good takeaway. But yeah, that should happen, you're right, Carrie. Taboo talk number 2, then the questions focused a little bit off of that first one. We kind of built off of that first set. What's next? What gets in the way? And here again, they went with the cross, Myron. I don't know why. And they went in cursive, which was harder, but here's the word cloud. People, again, at the center. As the church is the people, not the steeple. That's always a good, a good word to hear. Others, family.
Family gets in the way. That's interesting.
Yeah, oh yes, absolutely. Who here has had fun Thanksgiving with friends or relatives? Yep. So the first question was, we asked people to describe an experience where they felt respected or disrespected. Again, it was up to you to decide if you went positive or negative, for your political views.
Oh, this is from
And then the question was, what would have made it more respectful? And this is where family comes up.
Yeah.
The most people responded they experienced a lack of respect for their political opinions from family. Not a surprise, but not surprising. 5 people said their challenges were with political denominations, parties, or other key words. So one person said, I said I was a Democrat and I felt people judged me. Or I said I was a moderate and then I felt like my opinion didn't matter anymore. So kind of that the whole party affiliation piece was the trigger that let people feel respected or disrespected. And it stopped communication. 4 people said that they were hoping to modify one's behavior or others' behavior. You can't change other people when talking politics. And so for 4 people, it was I was disrespectful. Some of them were personal reflections of like, I lost my cool when I was talking with so-and-so. Or, I'm really hoping I could change my spouse. Again, Codependent No More is an excellent resource as far as that goes. 4 people shared that their experience feeling disrespected or respected was on social media. And then 3 said they felt it at church. Interestingly, I know my response was one of the church ones. And in reading the responses, those people who felt disrespected at church also were people who have at some point in time worked in a church. So it wasn't like church was not the primary place, it was a primary place for the person. So my experience was one of the 3 church ones. So So again, not that it's not happening to other people, but it was interesting to me that the people who responded this way all had connections and said that in their responses. I was a pastor and so on and so forth. Question 2, what is essential for us as a congregation to move forward? This is the next steps. What do we need to do to move forward? And here, again, no one opinion, but really good clusters of opinions. So 6 people said more common ground, keep focusing on respect and listening. The more we can, I'm going to introduce a new word to us all, the more we can Zeidlerize hot topics, the better it'll help us move forward. 6 people said they were hoping to have a platform for political discussions at St. Matthew's. So the creation of something that offered a regular or some sort of regular, some sort of, when there's a political issue, when you talk about, here's what we're going to do. They felt that was a necessary piece. 4 said, keep on being positive and keep on striving to be diverse. 3 people said they wanted to have an accepting attitude toward political discussions outside of worship again, which is makes sense as a takeaway. 3 people said lifting up social justice rather than politics, which I took to mean if we use the code words, no one will know what we mean. Or that if we focus on the people rather than the politicians or on the politics. So that's the social piece that I think is helpful for us to think about. 2 people said fears about social media and how we use it, and others said go back to the Bible. All good responses there. All pretty abstract though, if you noticed. Not a lot of specificity, which is where this gets hard. The third question we ask is, what motivates you? And what holds you back? And so the positive motivations were actually more than the holdbacks, which was great. I felt this was a more hopeful conversation. 6 people said they were motivated by being able to talk about their beliefs and exchange ideas without being attacked. Again, the more we can Zeidlerize hot topic issues, the better. People said they were motivated by Christian values, by caring for others. And 1 said they were motivated by the national momentum towards having more political conversations. And I'm trying to remember the context of it. I think it was through some of the issues around the Women's March and other pieces, but that had been a positive motivator to get someone to get involved or stay involved in that work. What holds us back? This was really telling, and I think good learning. 5 people said what holds me back from engaging more or doing more or being involved in these discussions is wanting to avoid an argument or prevent being attacked.
That's a Lutheran answer.
It's a very Lutheran answer historically. It's a very upper Midwestern answer, in my experience. Well, I'm going to go into my Scandinavian/Irish accent and say, we just don't want to upset anybody here. We want to make sure things are okay. I don't want to make sure I'm attacking Holy there. So all of these things, that I think that's a common and a very human response. It is kind of rooted in our Lutheran tradition, but also I think it reflects the what's the word? The heightened tension that people feel around these things. And it's, again, it's hard. I'm at the chiropractor and I get this conversation, like I'd like to go away and hide now. That would have been my answer right here, hide away. Also, what holds people back is having to listen to views that are challenging. That also, to me, makes sense culturally. There's been some research that says we live now more than ever in communities and bubbles in which we don't hear other opinions. We tend to fraternize and socialize and be around people who like us, who are like us. And then we're also held back by social media, or access to information. Someone had said in their response, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know what is truth, the old Pontius Pilate question. And so that held them back from participating. I don't feel that I know enough. This one was interesting, a little bit less hope after the conversation than before. I believe positive change is possible. It seems like a lot of people who were a great deal before went down to quite a lot afterwards, which is not a bad thing. I think it's an honest reflection of this is hard work and there's not an easy answer. And I think, at least my experience was listening to these conversations, it was clear there was no easy answer. So,
It's interesting that they said positive change
yes,
as opposed to just change.
yes,
Yeah.
yep. And that's they have that question every time. So it must be something in their sociological research model. But yeah. And what is positive might depend on your own perspectives, you know? If you're I don't want to get attacked.
Subjective.
Yeah.
Yeah, yep,
It really even adds a whole other dimension of subjectiveness.
yeah, you're right.
What do you mean by positive? Well, it means something different to everyone.
Right, as does politics and church and, whew. Well, what we took away from this second session, which was I think most important, was what is most important, what are the themes that we want to focus on? And these were pretty clear, again, kind of in groupings. Focus on listening and open dialogue on different topics, the Zeidlerification. Focusing upon social justice issues as Christians. Again, I think that relates to, a lot of people shared examples of partnership or personal relationships that impacted how they viewed things. Because I know this person who is struggling, that issue has a different face for me. And so I think that's the social piece that we can really lift up. I like this next one. It was super Lutheran. St. Matthew needs to be balanced as well as a risk taker. That's someone's direct quote. And I think it's awesome. So thank you to whoever said that. And ultimately, I want to speak for myself, and Chris, if you want to disagree, it's okay. I think that's what we're trying to do, ultimately. And it's the beauty of having three pastors, is that we have three different perspectives, and that, you know, we're not going to hopefully steamroll it the same way on a regular basis, but also that sometimes it's worth being bold for the sake of the gospel or for the sake of the values that Christ calls us to. A lot of people wanted a deeper exploration of what is political, which makes good sense. Is it policy? Is it parties? Is it what? And then a deeper reflection on being challenged or being comfortable. What is the point of church? Again, I don't think we're going to change anybody there, you know, but it might be helpful to hear why that is for each person. And then a couple people said, we don't need to do anything, we're good.
Oh, wow.
And that was a small scattering, but interesting. Okay, we have like 30 seconds of the whole third session, so let's talk about immigration really fast. Here's the word cloud, not a cross, Myron. Country, family, children. Children came up a lot in our conversation, I know.
God got in there.
God got in there, yeah.
Neighbor church.
Yes, yep. And it probably got separated from El. But El Salvador came up a few times, yeah. Question one, I did a pie chart this time. We asked people to share a personal experience of how immigration has impacted them. And it was almost a third, and a third of the people who were there who shared their experience of immigration that was impactful personally on them was their family or ancestors immigrating. A third said it was a workplace or a work experience. So I encountered someone in the course of working, or I work with someone for whom immigration is important or who's immigrated. And then the third was, and this is fascinating, hosting or sponsoring families. So whether it was with AFS or other exchange programs, high school students, through partnership globally, through refugee resettlement, that was a big place where people had immigration experiences that were impactful. And most of those, I'm guessing, were connected to church. So good work, church. There was one response each for school, church, and someone didn't have an experience they felt they shared. The church one is mine, so you can throw that under workplace, work experience. We also asked what Christian beliefs and values shaped your perspective, trying to get people to say, I believe this about immigration, why? What is it about Christianity that makes me do that? And this again, two real big clusters came. Number one was love. Love of neighbor or love of stranger. And the other one was welcoming the stranger. There were a few people who shared responses that were about inclusivity, which is a Christian value, kindness, a universal human, but also Christian value, and equality. So those are a little bit less Christian, but more ethical, moral values. And then, lastly, what values shape your perspective? A lot of people refer to Jesus in their responses of love and welcome. Old Testament passages on welcoming the stranger or the sojourner in your land. And a few people shared about the Lutheran understanding of the respect for authority. And so I feel this way, but I also want to respect the legality pieces. That was a place where people felt some tension, which makes sense. Because question 2 was, where do you feel pulled in 2 directions when you think about your own perspectives on immigration? 4 people said they didn't have any struggle, or they didn't feel torn. And most of the respondents here shared that they felt this was an overblown issue, or it wasn't as impactful as other social issues that were more important to them, or that they already had a clear opinion. So those 4 answers were not universal, but it was, I don't feel tension. The highest group of people said that their issues were with the legalities and the laws. They feel torn. We need to have some sort of law. How do we follow it? I don't know. Parents versus children. How do we negotiate some of those pieces? That was places. Other struggles included, what is citizenship? This is too complex. Government policies versus how they get practiced. Do we have quotas or not? Economics, security. So, but mostly it was, how do we have these laws? What if I don't agree with them, but we need something? That seemed to be where most of the tension came through for people. I was hoping there'd be some more clusters there, but there weren't really. And then, the third question was, what's most important in discussing more about immigration? And these are some questions that people posted that I thought was interesting. So these are kind of direct quotes. Why do people live in fear? That's a good question to think about with that. This country was formed by immigrants. When did we become so exclusionary? Hint, it's not just recently. Another person shared, my inner struggle is about undocumented immigrants, especially those from Latin America. I got fired up to do something, but I haven't done it yet. What kind of things can I do that will help someone? And that was something we heard again and again. I want to help, I don't know how. And then somebody asked, do children even know how to do this? And my question, I would add on that, do adults really know? It's harder and harder to figure out those paths and what those things are. So these are all topics that got discussed more in the small groups. A lot of people talked about DACA and sanctuary as well. And some of the economics and how do we, but ultimately people were like, how do we stay involved as a congregation around the issue of immigration? These were 2 quotes that I thought were worth lifting up that kind of reflect the whole reason we did this process. I don't think I'm as educated as much as I need to be. And then someone else shared, not talking in church does not solve the problem. It can only heighten the problem. That was specifically about immigration. So not just in general. And this was perhaps, the Zeidler Center shared that this is one of the best responses they've ever had to this question in any group. So people said, I believe that listening circles, which is their process, help build trust and relationship. They said they've never seen an upline in that orange quite like that before. Which means that, again, this has proven to be worthwhile and fruitful, even if it doesn't give us clear steps. And so, how do we move beyond the binary? I think this is more my reflection than the Zeidler's, but how do we as St. Matthew's move beyond the you're this or you're that? Are we already beyond the binary? Some of the clusters might suggest that we already are, but we still use kind of those us-them terms to talk about us, or about the people we think are on our side and the people we don't. This is an editorial from the Christian Century from February, and they were talking about climate change, and they interviewed a scientist named Catherine Hayhoe. And this is a direct quote from the article. She said, she suggests that matters of identity are also prominent in another area of debate, that of climate change. Hayhoe finds that whenever she talks to Christians who are skeptical about climate change, the skeptics don't really have a problem with the science. Rather, rather they resist the idea of climate change because it conflicts with their sense of identity. And so what she's saying there is people who identify as a Christian aren't skeptical of the science, but if they're coming from a place that believes in a 7-day creation or a place that doesn't see those pieces, they can't go there because their Christian identity is stronger than their identity on this issue.
But then it sounds like they do have a problem with the science.
Well, right, but they wouldn't identify it. The people that didn't identify it as I think you're right. Ultimately, it is a science, but they identified it as a faith issue and not a science issue. And so I think that what this was helpful for me in reading was to say, okay, this is helpful, but it's really helpful in that in what ways do we put our political identity or our Christian identity above our own social decisions and actions? So whether it's immigration, whether it's any topic, to me the question is, how do we help people understand their sense of identity and their values? Which I think I like about the Zeidler process because it helps us go to this specific place of deeper values, which can be hard work and a lot of personal work. The last piece is a list of how-tos for constructive conflict. This just came out from Yale University in an article they called Fighting Like Christians. And the author talks about, here are her 6 steps to having constructive conflict in church. And I listed in orange, which I realize now is a crappy color to project, the things that the Zeidler process has done for us at St. Matthew's. Teach open communication practices. That's part of the process. Joyce Ann Mercer says, pay attention to the practices that help us maintain connection apart from the controversy. Interestingly, some of our small groups are very politically diverse, and they meet as small groups. And they might not talk about the issues they disagree about, but they found ways to maintain connections apart. So I think in some ways our small group ministry can maintain that as well. Take on controversial issues in conversational spaces. We hear that again and again and again. I think that's the biggest takeaway that we learned concretely from this process. Be prepared to work with others to put boundaries around behaviors that cannot and should not be tolerated in a fight. And each of these other conversations were based on communication guidelines that said, use I statements, don't be a butthole, etc. Breathe. That's what I need. This 5th one I think is important for us as pastors and staff. Anticipate conflicts, not to avoid them or shut them down, but to plan ways of creating frameworks to help people face the differences healthily. I know that one of the flashpoints for some controversy was kind of our decision to do same-sex weddings 3 summers ago. And that some of the feedback we heard was fair feedback, is that we blindsided people with that decision, which is a fair critique. And that we anticipated conflict, but we didn't anticipate it to help people face their differences. So for me, that's a place like, yep, I can think back to that. Like, I think we would have done that a little differently. But that's a specific to our congregational life that feels that fits that kind of 5th one. And then lastly, hold listening sessions in smaller groups that allow people to experience themselves as both heard and acknowledged. So I think this process has done a lot of those, which to me is a good sign. The question becomes really then, what's next? We don't have super clear plans immediately. I will say that as far as social ministry goes, a lot of our summer programming around social issues has been shaped and impacted by the feedback from the Zeidler process. So some of our Sunday conversations on social issues will have more space for feedback in small groups. And we're going to continue to have that kind of Zeidler-esque discussion model. The Zeidler Center is prohibitively expensive. And so we can't just bring them in whenever we want. But it's possible that we could train a bunch of trainers to be our own St. Matthew's kind of merry band of non-anxious presences to do something like that. And the council talked a little bit about how do we continue to engage and encourage people to participate and continue to make it voluntary. So when the March for Our Lives happened back in March, we had a really influenced our staff discussion, these reports did. And it ended up meaning that we reached out to a group of people who reached out to us first and said, we can't support it, but we'll definitely, publicize. So it's figuring out, where does the church speak out? Where does the church support others, but not necessarily say, offer people the choice to participate, but not excommunicate people who don't believe the same thing or don't believe the same way. That not everyone's going to march on the streets, and not everyone's going to protest silently. And so, how do we live in the middle? And I think it's continuing to say we aren't going to all agree on everything, but that we aren't nearly as divided into two camps of peoples as I think we all think we are, politically, religiously, otherwise. So I think that we'll continue to have discussions like this as topics arise, and I know we're well past time. So if you have questions, I'll stay up here for a while because I'm the rover today. But thanks, everybody, and happy Pentecost. Red Shoe Sunday.